Hello, folks. Well, we're talking about Philippians. We're not in Philippians. We're talking about Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. And you probably know, well, of course you know, you've read this, that this text is about husbands and wives and their relation. It's also about the relation of Christ and the church. And the fact is, Paul really wants to talk about the relationship between Christ and the church in this passage. As he says at the end of the chapter, he says, this is a great mystery, and I'm applying it to Christ and the church. So he really wants to point out the relationship between God's people and God's Son. But he's going to use the relationship between a husband and a wife to be symbolic of that between Christ and the church. But he talks about both topics in this passage, doesn't he? And I think we ought, before we say anything, and of course before we say anything about husbands and wives in this passage, I think we ought to make clear that in Paul's day, women were not treated well at all. They were treated like slaves. They were treated like chattel, possessions of their husbands. They didn't have very many rights. And certainly both Jesus and Paul lift women in the early church and raise their dignity and the respect that we are to have for them. I think Paul is also concerned that Christianity does not appear to be subversive to the unbelievers. And so he makes some statements even here in this passage as if to say, even though Jesus has given dignity and worth and respect to women, women are to submit to their husbands, and husbands are the head of their wives. Other passages in the New Testament will bring this out, that Paul is concerned that unbelievers do not look down upon the church because of certain things and because of the way women are treated and so forth. Anyway, that's not this text. Let's move along and talk about this text, shall we? Husbands and wives, first of all. This is what Paul wants to talk about first. So let's discuss that, the husband and wife relationship. Paul tells wives that deference to their husbands is a duty they owe to the Lord. That's the meaning of verse 22. It's not that they are to submit to their husbands as they submit to the Lord. It is that this is a duty, submission to their husbands, that they owe to the Lord. They are to submit to their husbands. But we need to remember here too that in verse 21, Paul urges us all to submit to each other. So there is mutual submission commanded here. And we may find this to be a hard word, that Christians are to submit to each other. Yes, they are. What Paul has in mind here is that we are to reject self-centeredness and work for the good of others. I think that's really what he means by submission. Respect each other, realize the worth in each other, get rid of your self-centeredness and your self-absorption and work for the good of each other. And then in verse 23, Paul recognizes what we'll call the headship principle. He states there that the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. And as Christ is the deliverer and defender of the church, which is his body, the husband is the protector of his wife, who is one flesh with him. This, of course, does not mean, no sir, that a wife is the husband's to control or treat as he would like. Unfortunately, this verse has been used like a club to put women down. But headship has nothing to do with husbands being bosses to be served, and wives being their unthinking slaves. It's not what it's about to be head. This text does not endorse a chauvinist mentality that I've just described. All it asks is that wives give up self-centeredness and promote the benefit of their husbands. It asks, too, that husbands give up their self-centeredness and any privilege of being head in order to promote the well-being of their wives. Husbands are to love their wives as themselves, Paul writes, recognizing that the unity of marriage makes their wives their own bodies. We are to love our wives the way Jesus loved the church, and we are to love our wives as we love our own bodies, which we do. And of course, Jesus loved the church to what extent? Well, he gave himself for the church, Paul says, and husbands are to be just as self-giving for the well-being of their wives. So, by setting this highest of standards for the husband's treatment of his wife, Paul goes to the limit in safeguarding the wife's dignity and welfare. The second topic that Paul wants to discuss is the relation of Christ and the church. And actually, the relation between husband and wife is symbolic, as I said earlier. Symbolic of the relation of Christ and the church. That's verse 32. This text highlights the love of Christ. He loved the church and gave himself up for her. And what is the purpose of this self-sacrifice? To make her holy, to cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. This must surely be a reference to baptism. And to present her to himself without spot or blemish or any such thing. This text also highlights the lordship of Christ. And I suspect this is something we need to hear, don't you think? That we are to submit to Christ, that we have no other agenda but to submit to him as Lord. And this text also highlights the fact that Jesus still nurtures and cares for the church. That's verse 29. One of the great theological principles in this text is the idea that we are members of his body. Now think about that with me for just a moment. Christians are part of Christ. They are with him and one with each other. And that's something to think about and to enjoy. Well, this text has obvious importance for understanding the marriage relationship, but I hope you were able to see that that theme fades from center stage. The primary focus is on the relation of Christ and the church. And the key themes are the love of Christ and the oneness of Christians with him. That relation drives all other Christian relations, including that of husband and wife. I'll see you again in a few days, and of course I'm grateful that you are joining me in this study of Ephesians. We're just about a little over 3 weeks away from completing it, and then we'll begin a new study in a couple of weeks after that, and I can't wait to tell you what I have in mind for our next study. But I'm going to wait. I'll talk with you later. God bless.